Thank you very much for having me. And this presentation is on the fossil turtles from the late Cretaceous Nanaimo group of Vancouver Island. And as I mentioned, this is largely a review of the current state of affairs and some of the ongoing projects that I'm just beginning, and hopefully I can share the excitement and significance of the fossils that I'm describing. So next slide, please. So I'd like to acknowledge that the Royal BC Museum is located on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. I also want to highlight the fact that the fossils that you're going to see today were collected on the traditional territories of the Comox band. Next slide, please. So sea turtles today, or chelonioids, chelonioid turtles, are a quite diverse and well-known group. They're very charismatic vertebrate species. They're, of course, are only marine reptiles that are still extant today. There used to be a great many more marine reptiles, but now our turtles are some of our only representatives of that. But their fossil history, next slide, please, is a little bit more enigmatic, and the diversity of fossil turtles in the Cretaceous, particularly in the marine environments, is not well understood. And there's been a lot of study in the last few years that's really up to the number of recognized species worldwide, but we're still left with the fact that there's not really much in terms of known about the origins of modern groups in the fossil record of marine turtles. Next slide. So I'm going to highlight some specimens that are from the Courtenay area of BC, looking at the Nanaimo group. So we've got two sites along the Puntledge River, as well as a site on the Trent River. Next slide, please. All of these sites are the Haslam Formation, so about 84.5 million years old, and in particular from the Sphinoceramus schmidti zone of the Haslam Formation, because we can pretty confidently identify that, particularly from the fieldwork conducted this year with actual specimens of that index fossil found at the dig site itself. Next slide. So I'll go through what's known about these fossil turtles, starting with the Puntledge Site 1, which was historically collected. Next slide. This was a fossil described by Betsy Nichols in 1992, and as you can see, it's pretty fragmentary, but it contains preserved elements of the humerus, the coracoid, the dennary, the ilium, some of the peripheral shell bones, as well as a couple of unguals as well, and some other bone fragments. And it was identified as Desmatocheles cf. Lowi. But when you review some of the features, today there's been a lot that we've learned about protostegids, or this family of ancient marine turtles, since this was described in 1992. And a lot of the features used to characterize this as Desmatocheles are more broadly actually just characteristic of protostegids. So this material is worth a little bit of a revisit to know exactly what we have, but it is in the vicinity of the family tree of Desmatocheles. Next slide, please. If we look at some of the other species of Desmatocheles and some better preserved material, you can see some of the characteristic features. You can see, for instance, the relatively narrow symphysis of the dennary, so that is certainly very characteristic as well. There's also various features of the humerus as well, in terms of its proportions and the size of the lateral tuberosities that characterize it as being a protostegid. Next slide, please. And then I want to highlight quickly as well what the characteristic shell morphology of these animals look like. And you can see that protostegids have relatively smooth shells. If you look at the example on the right, these animals, they're sort of it's sort of a gentle bone texture, but nothing really in terms of bumps or any sort of ornamentation on the shell like you can see in some other turtle species that can be very, very characteristic of turtle families. Next slide, please. I'd also like to point out that the material that has been referred to Desmatocheles does tend to range in age. You can see the Colombian species of Desmatocheles from down in the Bohemian and Aptian, and that particular species is known from Colombia. Most of the Desmatocheles loci material is from the Cenomanian Turonian of the Western Interior Basin. And then the material that we have in the Haslam Formation of Vancouver Island is much later than that. It's Santonian in age. The dates are a little bit off on this figure. But if you sort of lower down those green boxes a little bit, where you get Desmatocheles CF loci from Vancouver Island, it's substantially later in time, and it actually co-occurs with a specimen that's been recovered from the Coahuila region of Mexico as well. And if you are familiar with the Baja BC hypotheses as well, which is quite well established at this juncture, you'll know that the paleobiogeography at that time actually puts Vancouver Island much further south during that time interval as well. So actually a pretty comparable location, but just on the other side of Western North America. So this, as I mentioned, probably indicates that there is some need to revisit some of that material, because given the fact of separation several million years, it's unlikely to be exactly the same species. And as I mentioned, we've learned a lot more about protostegids in the intervening years since 1992. Next slide, please. So moving on to the Trenton River site, this preserves an entirely different turtle species, but also from the Haslam Formation. Next slide, please. This material is disarticulated, but here's a bit of a reconstruction that I'm have been working on, and as I said, this is sort of ongoing work, but it seems to belong to a family of turtles called the Helochelydrids, and as some affinity with Niomecheles, which is an Aptian terrestrial turtle of all things. However, there have been some Helochelydrids that have been noted from estuarine environments as well. So it's a near-shore interpretation of the paleo environment is still consistent with the distribution of this turtle. Next slide. The notable thing about this family actually is the ornamentation on the shell, and you can see a magnification of that here. There's tiny tubercles that are about 1 millimeter across, and these are very pronounced bumps. They're not even just your normal tubercle. They are very sharply defined. They are in fact quite thin at their base and really look like sort of round capped cylinders that stick out of the shell. So it's very prominent, very distinctive ornamentation that we really don't see in any other groups of turtles. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to some more recent work. And so just earlier this year, I was contacted about a new fossil turtle that has been found on the Puntledge River, actually just a few kilometers downstream of where Dr. Nichols' turtle was found. And next slide, please. And here's a shot of the site along the Puntledge River from earlier this spring, when we were able to go out and collect it in April of this year. Next slide, please. Here's the block as it was before it was collected. We've done as little sort of over preparation of the specimen as we can. Next slide, please. But you can see here highlighted several different disarticulated parts of this turtle skeleton. So we have multiple parts of the plastron, of the carapace, as well as on the right-hand side in sort of the skinny area looks to be some postcranial elements as well. So we think it's more than just a shell. And I'm crossing my fingers that once we get it back opened up in the lab here and prepared, that there's going to be some skull inside. That would be excellent. Next slide, please. This photo didn't turn out particularly well, but I also wanted to highlight a bit of the texture of the fossil turtle as well, the texture of the surface. And the sculpturing is such that it's not smooth like you see in Dysmatichelys, and it's also not very pustular like in Niomecheles. It seems to be basically have a sort of broad bumps, the sort of a gentle sculpturing, which doesn't correspond to either of those groups. So it's looking like a potential third species of turtle from this same unit here, which would be very exciting. And it's not a family that I actually recognize. So there's a lot of work to be done that's going to have to wait on the preparation of the specimen. Next slide, please. So I want to go just quickly and talk about why the fossil turtles in the marine assemblage are so interesting here. And it has to do a lot with the changes in the ecosystem that happen in the Campanian. So with this being a Santonian assemblage, there's not a lot of samples of vertebrates in the Santonian, and there's a lot of changes that take place immediately before the Campanian sort of regular assemblages that were typical of the Western Interior Basin, and in fact elsewhere in the world as well. And so, next slide, please. One of the changes seems to happen is that as you get a transition into the Campanian, protostegids become very, very large. They're not a small turtle normally, but then in the Campanian you get the truly large protostega as well as archelon that are just these massive, massive turtles. And then they go extinct. Basically by the end of the Campanian, there aren't any protostegids that we're aware of in the fossil record. Next slide, please. Helichelydrids have a sort of a similar pattern as well. They're most abundant in sort of the early or early late Cretaceous assemblages worldwide. In North America, they become extinct in the Middle Campanian, and then they become extinct worldwide at the end of the Maastrichtian. So these groups, which we're finding, go through some pretty severe changes and extinctions sort of immediately after this time period. So this is really interesting to sort of get this before shot of these assemblages. Next slide, please. So in summary, next slide. So the Haslam Formation preserves possibly 3 species of fossil turtles in a nearshore environment. They belong to protostegids, helichelydrids, and possibly an additional family that is currently unknown at this time. And then the specimens represent a rarely sampled vertebrate biome just before some major extinctions for marine turtles. And we still don't know in the marine assemblage where the fossil turtles that are our long ghost lineages for our modern turtle groups originate. So that's really exciting. Next slide, please. I have a lot of people to acknowledge, including my collaborators that working on various parts of this project, Victoria Arbor, Don Brinkman, Matthew Vavrick, Joe Morin, as well as the finders of these various finds. I was not the one who found any of these fossils, so I'm incredibly thankful for all of the people going out there looking for fossils and finding them and reporting them, and as well as the big volunteers, provincial partners, and funding sources. Next slide. Thank you.